Welcome to Immigration Review, your weekly source for immigration case law updates and insights. I'm your host, Kevin A. Gregg, back again to review the week's precedential immigration cases, rummaging through the decisions so you don't have to. This podcast is sponsored by Kurzban, Tetzeli, and Pratt, also known as KKTP, a law firm where I'm also a partner. Whether you are facing an immigration obstacle, a serious injury, or a legal issue in your business, KKTP will aggressively protect your best interests. This podcast is also sponsored by Docketwise, an all-in-one immigration forms and case management solution trusted by thousands of immigration lawyers across the U.S. I really like Docketwise. It makes immigration applications easy by allowing the clients to provide information through simple online questionnaires that are shareable by text or email and available in multiple languages. Not only that, Docketwise provides a comprehensive group of case management features, including invoicing and calendaring, secure messaging, task management, and a lot more. You can learn all about Docketwise and receive a 10% discount on your subscription by heading to docketwise.com/immigration-review, so they know we sent you. And as always, this show does not constitute legal advice and has no bias other than to keep you up to date and to enable you, my dear colleagues, to excel in court. So, without further ado, let's start the review. I know it's been a while, but I've got another special episode for you all. In this special episode, I speak with Bashir Ghazialam. Bashir is a well-respected attorney in San Diego, practicing in the areas of immigration, federal actions against the U.S. government, and Defense-Based Act claims, which I believe are like workers' compensation claims against the U.S. government for actions that arise out of military bases at home and abroad. I say I believe because, unfortunately, we didn't get to talk about it, and that's my fault. See, I wanted to speak to Bashir most of all because he is from Afghanistan and came to the U.S. as a refugee at 13 years old in the 1980s. Many of his clients are now from Afghanistan or are trapped there, and he knows more about what's going on than anyone I know. While running a law practice in the early 2000s, Bashir somehow found time to serve as a legal consultant with the Afghanistan Judicial Reform Commission, which was then charged with helping draft Afghanistan's post-Taliban constitution, and later with the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue based in Geneva to work on a special report relating to the status of rule of law and justice reform in Afghanistan. He's advised the former Afghan government, the U.S. Department of State, the list goes on. Couldn't think of a better person to talk to about Afghanistan, so I talked to Bashir. And we talked a lot. I hope you enjoy and learn something, because I certainly did. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Immigration Review. It's been a while since we had a special episode, and I think this is a really important special episode. And, from the onset, I'm going to just say, because I so often forget to say it, it is currently October 10th, Sunday evening. That's when we are recording this episode. And I'm speaking with Bashir Ghazialam, who is an attorney in San Diego. Bashir has been an attorney for about 20 years. He is an immigration attorney, and he also does Defense-Based Act claims, an area of law that I know nothing about that we're going to get into during this interview. Bashir is a well-established attorney in San Diego and nationwide. In immigration, I know him from, of course, the Facebook groups, and everyone's active in the community, but I know that Bashir is very well respected in San Diego and throughout the country, and that he also brings federal claims, usually in D.C., against the U.S. government, and that he's been fighting for immigrants for 20 years. Bashir is himself an immigrant, coming to the United States as a refugee at 13 from Afghanistan, and I wanted to talk to Bashir about Afghanistan because, at least in my small circle of such people, he is the person who knows the most about what is currently happening in Afghanistan and what immigration attorneys and non-immigration attorneys can do for the Afghan diaspora and individuals in Afghanistan. So, Bashir, thank you so much for speaking with me this evening, and I hope you're well.
Well, thank you, Kevin. I'm glad to be here. I look forward to speaking to you.
And Bashir, you and I, we've actually never met. We've seen each other in the Facebook groups. We've talked to each other. We know of each other, but we've never actually met in person. One of the weird features of COVID, I suppose, and technology. So it's a pleasure to meet you, if over Zoom.
Well, yeah, these days you can know somebody in person for 20 years, and at the same time you can know somebody very briefly virtually, and you have a very closer relationship. You feel like you know that latter person much better than the former. So it's all about quality, not quantity or format or style or anything like that.
So thank you for being on the show. And, I say all of that for all the listeners because I'm going to be learning a lot of the things that we're talking about today for the first time as well with everybody else. And so I'm very interested, and I'm happy that you came on to speak. So to start off and to just jump right into it, can you give us a bit about your background, your personal story, and all of that?
Well, sure. My personal story pretty much starts with my name. And my last name was created by my father and his brothers in the 1960s, when Afghans who typically do not have last names, they only go by first names. And they usually adopt last names when they need to. And generally that is because when they have to immigrate outside of the United States and they have to apply for a passport. Even previously in passports, they didn't really contain the last names, but that's a whole long story. So they sat down and they thought about what kind of name last name they should adopt. And generally, Afghans will look at their father's name and their grandfather's name. And very generally, they will take their grandfather's name. So they decided not to do that for the reason that they wanted to have my grandfather's grandfather's brother's name, who was a hero in the 1860s and 1870s, back then, in the late 1800s, in the war against the British. So he was a Ghazi. Ghazi means, it's an Arabic term that means a war hero. Back then, it was a very prestigious title in Afghanistan. So he was a Ghazi, and he was our whole family is kind of honored and proud of him. So my last name is derived from him.
Just hearing all of that just now, which is, of course, just the introduction, how your name goes back to the 1860s because you have someone in your family very important. It just, to me, it indicates the uphill battle America might have had in interacting with Afghanistan. Myself, and I think most people I know in America, they wouldn't know a thing about their ancestors from the 1860s. I have no idea about any of them. And in your family, it's central to your name.
Well, yeah, because then my family became exiled after that, like a decade later. Alam ended up being killed by the then king, the Iron Emir of Afghanistan, because for the mere reason that Alam had made friends with the king's cousin, who was also later vying for the power, for the throne of Afghanistan. And later, because of the friendship that he had developed, he went and a last-ditch effort in order to go save his army that was cornered in somewhere in Afghanistan on the verge of losing the battle against this Iron Emir, who ended up ruling Afghanistan for over 20 years later. His friend, the king's cousin, was defeated because Afghanistan is, unfortunately, it has a very rich and very dramatic history that goes back centuries. And, I feel privileged that my family, I come from a family line who were basically educated, that goes back decades and centuries, where they were always educated. And as a matter of fact, my grandfather, who ended up dying of a heart attack when my dad was only 3 or 4 years old, back in the 1930s, they had returned from India, and he was born in India. So there was 2 generations of my family that was actually born in back then India, which is now Pakistan, Lahore, Pakistan, because Pakistan didn't exist back then. Pakistan was only formed later. So there's a lot of details and history in my family, which kind of gives me the drive all the time to kind of, live up to everything that my father has done, his father has done in the past, and everything that they have strived for. I feel privileged that I always had the opportunity living in America to get to where I am. I don't know where I'm going to end up, but so far where I've come, I really think that I give the most credit to all the opportunities that this country has provided to me all the time.
And so actually, just to summarize before we get to it, if I'm understanding the story correctly, your ancestor, your great grandfather's brother, was a war hero against the British in the 1860s, who then aligns himself with the brother of a king, presumably after the British are defeated?
Yeah, because they had, that brother of the king was also a war hero, and he had a very big instrumental role in actually driving the British out. So, Afghanistan has been ruled by the Pashtun tribe, of which I'm also a member of that tribe. And the majority of the Taliban are also Pashtuns. Afghanistan has had a dynastic family, ruling family for decades and decades. And a lot of times, transfer of power has not been as peaceful as the most recent transfer of power that we had in America. Right. In January.
Right. But were the British kicked out of Afghanistan for good? I just seem to recall Churchill really always being connected to Afghanistan. Weren't the British in Afghanistan until throughout World War II, or is that not correct?
No, the British were finally Afghanistan declared independence against Britain in 1919. That was the British were out by then, but there were 3 Afghan-British wars actually. But Afghanistan had already defeated the British way long before that. There were attempts of occupation. At the very least, it only lasted only a few weeks or something, but it didn't last 20 years for sure.
Right. And to say something that's obvious for you and maybe for me, but not necessarily for everyone, most Taliban are Pashtuns, but most Pashtuns are not Taliban.
Exactly. Thank you for making that clarification and distinction for me.
Right.
Because, about 50% of Afghanistan's population is made up of Pashtun, which is huge because the rest of are very small minorities. You would be amazed at how ethnically diverse Afghanistan is. And you would be amazed at how all these ethnic groups have kind of really spread out all the true fabrics of the society of Afghanistan, how they have intermarried, and it's very complex. And as a matter of fact, the Taliban started making their advances from the northern part of Afghanistan, and they had a very strong hold on the northern of Afghanistan, even though the northern of Afghanistan is mostly non-Pashtun majorities. But in any event, there are other minority groups, and yes, there's talks all the time. There's ugly phases of ethnic atrocities committed by rulers and everybody, but the overwhelming majority of the recent history of Afghanistan, all these ethnic groups have been able to amazingly live in very good peace and harmony with each other, despite a lot of the foreign influences and things like that. So basically, my point is that Afghanistan is a really very diverse country, and every province, every city has its own diverse neighborhoods, diverse villages, districts, everything. It's amazing. It's very incredible. It's very complex. That's why we lost. That's why America lost the war, is because number one, America didn't really understand Afghanistan. Number two, it was all profit driven. You mentioned I've been a lawyer for 20 years and I've been serving the Afghan community for 20 years, but I've actually been serving the immigrant community for longer than that. But out of the 20 years that I've been a lawyer, I also had the opportunity to go back to Afghanistan. Just opportunities rose one after the other after September 11th happened. You know how they say that within every tragedy, there's always opportunities, So out of every tragedy, especially for me, for example, when the Soviets when the coup happened, the communist coup happened in 1978. I was 7 years old. I lived in Kabul. I lived in a very peaceful Afghanistan. There were foreigners. There were more Americans living in my neighborhood that in the block of the houses that I passed through from my house to go to my elementary school. I saw more mainly Americans and other Europeans living in those neighborhoods in the 1970s than I saw Afghans. It was amazing, you know? And then all of a sudden, abruptly, everything changed. The coup happened. Everybody started taking off. The Americans were leaving back then because Americans loved Afghanistan even back then. In the 1960s, it was a prime destination for hippies and all of that. So yeah, I remember that. And I knew at that time when that happened, that jets went up in the skies and everybody knew that a coup happened. And then the next morning we were invited to go to the presidential palace where I was able to personally see the blood of the former ruler of Afghanistan, President Dawood Khan. He was killed with all of his family. I was able to see the flesh of the family still fresh in the garden of the presidential palace. Just being 7 years old, all of a sudden, just the whole world, my entire life at that point took a very different turn.
Why were you brought to the presidential palace at 7 years old? Or is it all of the Afghan
we were
families?
Everybody was all excited that, that there's a new era, and the president had been prime minister, whatever his title has been killed, and the new Communist Democratic Party of Afghanistan has taken over, and we're going to work for workers' rights. We're going to fight for workers. We're going to fight for the rights of the minorities. We're going to take away the land of all the feudals. We're going to redistribute all the land, and we're going to have a communistic country, blah, 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 and all of that. So all of the communism started happening. So I went with my mom and with the rest of my family in order to go check out, the new, it was everybody just wanted to go see and check out everything for themselves, because at that moment, everybody knew that this is the turning moment.
And so what's it like to live under communist Afghanistan in the late 70s and throughout the 1980s?
It was it's kind of like entering a long horror nightmare. After that, I started seeing, the war began, the resistance began. People went up in their roofs and they started chanting Allahu Akbar, and the protests against the Russians, and the marches began. Our favorite singers started becoming assassinated. Our intellectuals, our relatives started becoming arrested. My father was arrested. My uncle was arrested. My entire family was arrested.
Why were they arrested?
Well, because they didn't like communism. Oh, I mean, this is a long story. My dad, he was a doctor, but he was also a national. He was a national figure, and he had a lot of friends. He had come to America in the 1960s. He got his master's in medicine in Texas. He was just a really good, educated guy, and he then ended up becoming was chosen by his peers as one of their leaders, as a Writers Union of Afghanistan. They were the group the alternative to the Mujahideen. It's a long story, so I don't want to really I don't want to go on a tangent, but
understood. But it's interesting stuff, and so I'll do my.
My favorite uncle actually just disappeared. He was the kindest relative that I had, and I never forget that he disappeared. I think he joined the resistance movement, the Mujahideen, at advanced time, and then they went to his village and they hunted him down, and they killed a whole bunch of his other relatives, and they took him, and he disappeared. And I remember for months and months we were looking for him. So a lot of tragic stories, So
at the hands of the communists at this time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so I'm by no means an Afghan, a scholar on Afghanistan. I guess what I'm hearing is that, from the beginning, there's a communist takeover of Afghanistan, of a relatively secular nation with obviously an Islamic culture as well. But from the get-go, the resistance does have an Islamic nature to it. I am very aware that the Taliban comes much later and is trained in part with the backing of the United States in schools in Pakistan. But from the get-go, the resistance is not Taliban, but the resistance does have an Islamic nature. Is that about right?
Well, yeah, that was, maybe I should jump right into it because this is kind of a history. My dad had close ties with the United States from the 1960s. And he, even now I'm friends with the friends that he had, American friends that are professors and, really good members of here in America. So he also joined the resistance movement. He didn't have a choice. He wanted to be a doctor. He wanted to continue his profession, which he was very good at. But he ended up for 5 years filling two roles. One is to advocate on behalf of. He worked with the Doctors Without Borders and a lot of other agencies. So basically, he went back and forth over the border. He risked his life every day, every year. He went back and forth. He had a motorcycle where he took medicine over from Pakistan to Afghanistan, and he treated the Mujahideen. The ones that were shot, that were the ones that were dying, and he had saved tons of Mujahideen. But that wasn't his main mission. His main mission was to go, even despite all the war in Afghanistan back in the late 70s and early 80s, to go and work as a doctor. He was a very passionate doctor. He had a clinic in a Logar province, and in that clinic, every morning there formed a line of hundreds of people who wanted to go see him and get medicine from him and to get checked out and everything. So he was a very successful doctor. And at the same time, he also helped the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen took him in order to go to the battlefield and to go to treat the soldiers. And a lot of times he barely escaped attacks on himself by the Russians and the Afghan government and all of those. So while he was doing all of this, his kids lived in Kabul. We went to school in Kabul, Afghanistan in the early 80s while he was doing that. So I was away from my dad. I grew up away. My dad was away all the time, so that's why I really enjoy my time with my kids now, because I feel so privileged that, I even have the time to be with them every day. And then he ended up stepping on the toes of the other Mujahideen who ended up trying to recruit him to come to join their movement, and he refused to do that. And then there was one incident where one of the commanders came to his clinic and jumped the line in front of everybody, and he simply had a headache or something like that, and he demanded to seek treatment right away. And my dad told him, no, you have to go in the back of the line. That's the kind of a person my dad was, Mm-hmm. So he told him to go back into the back of the line. And he didn't treat him. So they obviously, when he closed up the clinic, they were waiting for him. They kidnapped him. He was gone for 2 days. I found out about this after the fact. So you can imagine that he being kidnapped and how he was able to, how other people that knew my dad were able to talk his kidnappers out of just releasing him without even hurting him. So that's the clout that my dad really had in Afghanistan. And then later on, he was invited to come to the United States. He testified in front of Congress in 1983. And he gave a very extensive testimony regarding what's going on in Afghanistan and what the Russians are doing in Afghanistan, all the atrocities that they're committing. It's all documented. So my dad was this doctor that went for 5 years with a motorcycle back and forth. I remember the motorcycle, when he had initially purchased it, it was red. So he had painted it like camouflage so that he wouldn't be detected by the airplanes, the Russian MiGs and the helicopters and all that. So basically, he came a few times to America. He was invited. He met with State Department officials, CIA officials, Congress, and he basically knew what was going on and exactly what was at stake back then, and what America's interests were, and why it was very important for America to have the right strategy for Afghanistan. So basically, I remember, after the fact, in the recent years, when he was telling us about these stories, where he basically, I just bluntly asked American officials, I said, what is your strategy? What is your long-term strategy for Afghanistan? The American official bluntly looked at him in the eyes and said, we don't have a long-term strategy for Afghanistan. We don't care. We don't care about the long-term strategy. Our strategy, we have one strategy. We want to defeat the Soviets by this war in Afghanistan at any and all costs. So that's our goal. And that's what our mission is, to defeat the Soviets. But my dad told them that, okay, well, you need to have a long-term strategy, because if you want to do it by these guys, the Mujahideen, they're not going to just stop at the Soviets. One day they're going to come and bite you guys in the back. And that's what happens.
At the basic level, the Mujahideen are essentially, it's a blanket term for a variety of different groups that were fighting the Soviets, with varying degree, with varying political ideologies, various religious ideologies, but I believe Islam runs through all of them. And at the time, in the early 80s, when your dad is testifying, there is no Taliban yet. The United States is backing the Mujahideen to varying degrees to try and get the Soviets out, but we're not talking about the Taliban at all.
No, we haven't even gotten to the Taliban. The Taliban was actually a reaction to what the Mujahideen ended up doing after they defeated the Soviets. So when the Soviets were defeated, then the Mujahideen were the victors, right? And then they left behind, after they withdrew their forces from Afghanistan in the late 80s. They still left behind a puppet government that was led by this gentleman. His name was Najibullah, and he did his best, just like Ashraf Ghani did his best, in order to try to reconcile the differences and to try to have a peaceful reconciliation. And he was in power for 3 years. He was supported still by the then Soviets. But then the Soviets obviously cutting down their support, and they stopped their support. And then his government basically fell to the Mujahideen. And then the Mujahideen entered Afghanistan in 1992. Where they weren't very good allies with each other. There were 7 main parties, and all of them were very big extremists, including the Northern Alliance, the ones that were in power until now.
Extremists in what way?
Extremists in their own fundamental Islamic interpretations, religiously extremist, ethnically divided. Most of them were based on their ethnic divisions and ethnic identities and things like that, down ethnic lines. So then they started fighting against each other in Kabul, and they ended up destroying Kabul. And millions, hundreds of thousands of people were innocent civilians of Kabul were killed. So that's why the Taliban started. They were students in the madrasa then. So all the Taliban were born into war, and most of them were in the madrasas of Kandahar and in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and they were religiously educated, very disciplined. And they rose to power because they had a lot of support from their communities, and just like they started having support. Obviously they've always had support within their constituents throughout Afghanistan, because mainly, as you can see, what distinguishes them from the other ones, the Mujahideen, is that we don't see mass levels of rape and retaliation and killing and all of those things. So there's a little bit of distinction there.
They can wrap themselves in what they say in conservative values and pure religion. That's how they place themselves and say we're different than the Mujahideen, who are not pure with their religion and who have just destroyed Kabul, and who they speak about Islamic values, but they don't do it. Look at us. We are the true believers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. And that's what it basically boils down to, is that that's what we're witnessing right now, too, that there's a clash right now between in the Taliban right now, is that, they don't want to alienate their main supporters or their base, where they, completely freely allow, for example, women to do, to work in the government and to not really crack down on women, but because unfortunately that's what the reality in Afghanistan is that women's rights is one thing, a very contentious issue in Afghanistan, unfortunately. It shouldn't be, but it is.
This is just fascinating to me. I've been wondering this myself. Countries are much more complicated than we know in the United States. I mean, even ISIS has a base in Iraq and in Syria. Why do the Taliban continue to have a base after 20 years of war, really 40 years of war, and where they are clearly not a democratic entity? How is it that they retain such a strong base after 20 years? What is it about Ghani and Abdullah and before him, President Kazi? Why is it that they don't seem to have a base, but the Taliban retains this base after 20 years of U.S. involvement in Afghanistan?
Well, it goes back to a lot of the strategic decisions that were made on the American side. If you can remember, the Taliban were pretty much driven out and they were on the verge of defeat, where they were actually willing to come back and surrender, basically, in return for having a role in the government back then in the early stages. And then Rumsfeld and his cronies, they pretty much turned them down. And then they started this big campaign, which basically was, at the very end, the roots of what went wrong all go to the corporate interests. We had no business of staying in Afghanistan after the mission was quote unquote accomplished back then. We basically turned it into a profit machine.
But I'll push back just a little bit on that, and I can. Much ink has been spilt about all the wrong things that the United States did in Afghanistan and how the United States failed to build a country that was viable and how corruption ran rampant. But I still don't quite understand how the Taliban retains this base of popular support. People who are willing to support them and to die for them and to choose them over, you said it yourself at the beginning, that Ghani was trying to piece together, create a country to allow these competing interests to build something. Why is it that the only entity in Afghanistan, and again, I'm no expert, why is it that the only entity that seems to have a true base of support is the Taliban?
Again, we have to acknowledge that Afghanistan is a tribal country. It has always been a tribal country. It has always resisted a central form of government. So it has been very difficult to bring a central government in Afghanistan that is able to have a grip on all of the regions there. And as far as, why it's not possible to have foreign forces in Afghanistan and to impose some form of government in Afghanistan. There's always going to be that resistance. There's always going to be that reason and that motivation for the disenchanted members of the population to go and realize all the inequalities and then blame it all on this foreign force that is here. And also it's religious. The Taliban, for example, are able to have a very loyal force that is willing to fight to the end and without any hesitation, without even any kind of salaries, in order to get what is promised to them, which is to become martyrs. And the reward to a martyr is very clear, 100% convinced, and they believe that they will get that reward, which is that 72 virgins, and also they're able to forgive 7,000 sinners and save them, and they get all of their own sins forgiven. So that's a big return that they get, as opposed to an Afghan soldier who's fighting for a corrupt and weak government, which was the Afghan government, where they were not even getting their salaries for months, and where they were not even getting their rations. They were going hungry. All the money that was coming from foreign aid, all of that was getting looted. So all of this, coupled with all the violence that was coming to Afghans, ironically, mainly by the Taliban, they are happy to have that kind of a compromise. Well, they're not really, because in what we're experiencing right now, because the alienation brings with it complete economic devastation, a major humanitarian crisis that is looming right now, the horizon in Afghanistan, unfortunately, and all of these other atrocities that come along with being alienated and being subjected to a very authoritarian rule. So this is all a compromise, and we also have to understand that Afghans generally are very tired. They're very tired of fighting. They're very hungry. They're very exhausted mentally and physically, and you can imagine. So it's a whole combination of all of those things.
I really appreciate you taking the time to speak about all of that. That wasn't on my outline so much, and I really appreciate it, and it's very interesting to me. I'd like to turn a bit now to your personal journey to America. What year do you come to America? How do you come here? And how old are you, and why do you and your family come to America at that time?
Yeah, like I said, I came here like in 1984. One of the things we struggle always as attorneys is that when we ask our clients, when did you first come to America? They start scratching their heads, and they're like, moving around in their chairs, and they're starting to get uncomfortable. Like, here come the questions that I'm not prepared for. So yeah, nobody knows when they came, but I know. And our flight was November 28th, 1984. And that was when we received the letter in the mailbox in Peshawar, Pakistan, of a friend. So my dad, when we were in Kabul in 1984, just immediately after he had returned from America, when he had confronted U.S. officials about what the long-term strategies of Afghanistan and everything is, and I didn't finish my story. I guess this is a good segue for me to go finish that story. Is that so? Basically, my dad was trying to convince the U.S. government to focus its aid to the other group that had formed in Afghanistan, the resistance group, who did not really belong to all these religious extremists that made up of the 7 groups that were also supported by Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and all these other countries that had their own agendas as far as what kind of Afghanistan they wanted. So he was lobbying for America to support the national figures of Afghanistan, who made up also of the former officials and the former governments, intellectuals, university professors, and all these other non-religious figures that had formed back then that were also based in Peshawar. So they had chosen my dad to become basically lobby on their behalf in order to divert the U.S. aid through them and not through the ISI and Pakistan and all of that we witnessed later. So then, and at the same meeting was sitting a Pakistani ISI agent who basically was the counterpart to my dad, who told this group of people that, no, I disagree. These people that Dr. Ghazialam is advocating for, they have always compromised in the past, and they will compromise with the Russians and with the Soviets, and that ultimately they will look out for the national interest of Afghanistan and then not really serve the national interest of the United States, which is to defeat the Soviets. And the only group of people that are guaranteed to defeat the Soviets are these mujahideen, because they deem it as a jihad, and through jihad, they're ready to fight
And so ISI, that's kind of like the Pakistani CIA, right?
Yes.
And they're still quite active in Pakistan and in Afghan affairs. Is that about right?
Yeah. It's alleged that they are behind the Taliban, and they're always helping the Taliban. And with their assistance, they were able to conquer Afghanistan in such a short period after the U.S. forces left. So this Pakistani agent can convince the U.S. officials to make that very fateful decision in order to direct all of its support through these 7 groups. So basically, when my dad went back, and then he was, for the second time, he had become the target of an assassination attempt, where they tried to run him over with his motorcycle. A car came and they tried to run him over over a creek. And miraculously, my dad survived that attempt at his life. And at that point, he knew that his life was in danger. So he went and made an application for refugee status. And within 6 months, our case was approved. And when he had gotten the initial news that he could bring his family over, so he sent some guides in order to bring the rest of his family from Afghanistan to Pakistan. So we engaged it was about a 10-day trek from our village in Afghanistan to walk with the help of some mules to carry our belongings, to walk over the mountains and over the passes in the nighttime to evade the Soviet forces and to go through the front lines of the Mujahideen and then make it over to the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Late spring, early summer of 1984, we were able to go to Pakistan, my mom and my siblings, and join our dad in Pakistan, where he was waiting for us. And then we ended up living in Peshawar, Pakistan for about 6 months. And then until we got our final boarding documents to go to Islamabad. Obviously, we went for a couple of interviews to the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad. I never forget, I was 13 years old. I remember when we walked into that big hallway of a work area where there was a lot of cubicles and a lot of these American employees, were all looking at us because there were 6 kids, including my parents. And then I remember when we were walking, they were counting all of us. They're like 1, 2, okay, wow, this is a pretty big family here. I never forget that interview. And obviously my dad was an excellent English speaker already, and he was able to communicate very well in that interview. And then next thing you know, we were on a plane from Islamabad to America, and we landed in New York. But then we went on to Philadelphia, where a gentleman was waiting for us in the airport. And he had a station wagon, and we sat in the station wagon, and he took us to a neighborhood in the North Philadelphia area where he had already rented us a house. It was right after the Thanksgiving weekend, I remember. And he had already brought furniture like mattresses and blankets, and God bless him, he worked for Catholic Charities. Then the next morning he came and took us in the subway. Took us to the downtown Philadelphia to finish our paperwork. That's where it all began in America, our American journey.
So, Bashir, your dad, the attempt on his life, did that happen in Pakistan or Afghanistan?
The kidnapping happened in Afghanistan.
With the riding him off the road.
That was in Pakistan. So that was very serious.
As an immigration attorney who does asylum cases just like you, I can't help but let this pass. Your father and you and your family are refugees from Afghanistan with a father who lived in Pakistan, who had an attempt on his life done in Pakistan, and who was in part fleeing ISI agents in Pakistan and Mujahideen supported by the United States, but who are brought to the United States because their lives are in danger in an allied country in Pakistan. But technically, they are refugees from Afghanistan. Is that about right?
That's correct. Yeah, our asylum claim was not based on persecution by the communist regime in Afghanistan or by the Soviets. Our asylum case was based on persecution by the Mujahideen and the Pakistani government.
You're essentially refugees from U.S. allies, in part.
You can call it that. Exactly. Yes. aware of all the details of our case, but our fear was also, I'm sure, based on my father's opposition to the government. Also,
of course, he's in Washington testifying against the communist government. It's just that just shows you sometimes there is a natural tendency as lawyers and of judges, and I get it, really, to simplify these asylum claims sometimes, but some things can't be simplified in human nature.
Correct. Yes, that's why asylum. I mean, it's just takes so much development. The facts need to be developed, the background. And it's very detailed, it's a very specialized area.
Can't be done in a 2.5 hour individual, huh?
Oh, no. Yeah, no way. Yeah.
So what did it mean to have that individual from Catholic Charities? You're 13 years old. You just came from Afghanistan. What was that like to come to a foreign country and then to have somebody here to actually make sure everything went perfect?
I mean, that's so indispensable. I mean, for everybody, in my life, I think, because you see, the first glimpse of America you see is the humanity, that is connected with it. And so it kind of is very eye-opening. Obviously, as a refugee, you also, as a foreigner, you come with a lot of your own prejudices, for example. A lot of the immigrant community that we met, the Afghan new immigrants, they were very suspicious, and they were always warning us that, okay, don't allow this group of people to your house, or don't accept their invitations because they're Christians and they're trying to convert you to Christianity. So, there's a suspicion, in the community that you have to kind of fight against. I give all the credit to my father, who really had a very open mind with everybody, and he always accepted the invitations and took us to church events where we were able to go get exposed to, for example, a nice church, and go see a rehearsal or of a piano, go to a function, a musical or something like that, be able to sing with them and all of that. And it was just kind of a reinforcement that you don't necessarily have to be so secluded in a society where you're so you have to be able to have the level of confidence in order to grow when you come to America, because all of those experiences, there were character building. We were able to meet some really good humanitarians and get exposed to them. Obviously, when you're a new refugee, you also get exposed to the dark side of America too. You get to get exposed to what's going on the streets, to the bully environment, to the bullies and certain types of cultures out there, drugs, alcohol, violence, all of these influences that are part of the American society. But obviously, I remember when we were in the airport, my dad sat all of us down, and he told us that before we get out of this airport, I have to give you this lecture, and hopefully this is going to be my final lecture that I give you guys. So he told us that in America, there's only two sides. There's nothing in the middle. It's either you can turn America into a heaven for yourself, or you can turn it into hell. There's no middle ground. And in order for you to turn it into heaven, you have to go to school. You have to pursue education in this country. If you don't pursue education, then your life is not going to be as rosy. So that's kind of, that was always kind of sticking in the back of my mind from the get-go, the way I approached my life and my career in America.
It's a good point. I mean, most people don't know refugees, but refugees by definition are people who have that usually have experienced a horrible trauma and horrible conditions, or by definition have a well-founded fear of it. And there's this kind of idea that they should be these people who just are so grateful for everything, and they should come to America and everything should be rosy and they should integrate quickly. But of course, refugees have their own prejudices. Refugees have a hard time. Refugees are suspicious of everybody. And those first few days, weeks, months of integration, I guess I'm hearing, are key.
Yeah, and this takes us to what's going on now. So, that's why I don't really walk away from any opportunities in order to help any new immigrants because I know the treatment that I received and how long it went, those key influences and those gestures of humanity that I experienced is priceless. So that's why it's very important for us, even though we're right now going through a period, I would call it kind of a dark period in America, in a very anti-immigrant environment. Unfortunately, obviously, we have a majority of Americans who are very compassionate, and we don't want to kind of brush that aside because the humanity still exists in this country. But at the same time, I think that there's so much division, and immigration has become such a divisive issue in this country. So even under this environment, I think it goes a long way to make sure that we are able to supplement all the other organized efforts that are going out there, such as, all these resettlement agencies are overworked or overburdened. And I think that every person that volunteers and decides to go and follow some kind of a group who's out there active, trying to feed a hungry new refugee family or trying to get some much needed clothing to them or some kind of a very much needed hot meal for them right away. I think that really goes a long way, because even if a new immigrant spends one night or 2 nights of their new life in America hungry, especially their kids, I don't think that's really the American way. And we should not really have to let that happen.
I'm going to have links to this in the show notes, and I want to end with that. But I personally, and I think for a lot of people listening, I'm just curious. I mean, Bashir, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show the most is because you actually have clients in Afghanistan, and you have clients that recently came from Afghanistan. Putting aside what we can read on the news and the military situation, the political situation, what is going on in Afghanistan right now for your clients?
It's not a very pretty picture right now as far as what's going on. I mean, there were opportunities after opportunities to try to save or evacuate or avoid putting our very key allies in the situation, especially those group of people that have a pathway of immigration in the United States or had a pathway of immigration. They were made promises. They meet all the qualifications, but despite all the efforts that they have made, they are still stuck in Afghanistan. And all of this being stuck in Afghanistan didn't really happen overnight. This has been going on for years and years. And having practiced as an Afghan-American attorney, obviously I have a very keen and intricate past with consular processing and all the issues relating to issuance of visas to, for example, special immigrant visa applicants. For those of us that don't know who that is that is for visas, special visas that have been allocated for allies that have provided faithful and valuable service to the United States cause. It's a very expansive group of people that it could include. So those people have been trying to immigrate to the U.S. for many, many years, and a lot of them have really been stuck in all kinds of backlogs, security backlogs. There we got the quote-unquote blacklisted interpreters, the terminated interpreters, and interpreters that have really been treated very illegally by their past employers. And as a result of that, they have all these obstacles to overcome in order to bypass all of these stringent visa requirements and backlogs. So the problems go back more for years and years. But unfortunately, having a well-founded fear of persecution in Afghanistan, we're talking about tens of millions of people.
Yeah.
And just kind of trying to weed out the cases where they actually have some kind of a practicable chance of getting some kind of a way out of Afghanistan is a task in itself. So it's a pretty complicated situation right now. And to be honest with you, there's really nothing new. All the roads have been blocked, either intentionally or unintentionally, by our own actions. So it goes back to the Doha Agreement. It goes back to the sudden fall of the Afghan government. Goes back to moving the deadlines around. It goes back to evacuating or prematurely leaving certain strategic bases. And it goes back to basically tying our own hands behind our backs and really keeping absolutely no negotiating power over the Taliban. So this is the situation we're kind of dealing with right now. And there's a lot of hype and there's a lot of rumors out there. There's a lot of hoopla out there. And there's a lot of people that think that, okay, they've heard about this new thing called the humanitarian parole. I want to apply for it myself because I think somebody told me that it's going to expire in 2 weeks. And then you get bombarded with hundreds and thousands of calls because somebody doesn't understand exactly what humanitarian parole is, how long it's already been in existence in our statutes for all these years, and how rush and all of the clog up in the airport happened. All of that, unfortunately, is self-made. We created all of that by our own actions and misactions and inactions. So we can talk about the details of all that, but it's really frustrating that right now, even if you have a humanitarian parole, it's not your ticket out of Afghanistan. There's a lot of other hurdles that you have to overcome in order to actually make it to the United States by way of advanced humanitarian parole, which is really the last option. And it really kind of developed into this because unfortunately the U.S. authorities, just because they didn't want to deal with any new things, they didn't want to come up with any new solutions, any other ways in order to evacuate people who are in imminent harm of being hunted down and killed by the Taliban in any quicker way than to direct everybody to send this packet over to this lockbox in somewhere in Dallas, Texas, and expect to be evacuated anytime soon. Ain't happening.
Without getting into the specifics of humanitarian parole, I mean, there is no UN entity in Afghanistan doing refugee adjudication and then plucking Afghan individuals out, right? And so I guess, are we still doing flights? I mean, even if you have a document, you're processing in where? Islamabad? You have to get yourself out of Afghanistan before you can even fly to America if you even have a legal pathway?
Yeah, and it's not even guaranteed that the Pakistan post is going to accept to further consular process, whether it's your humanitarian parole application or whether it's an approved I-130 application. So basically people are just stuck. There's no embassy in Afghanistan. There's no post. There's no consular post. So even if you have an approved petition and you have your case is documentarily complete at the National Visa Center, and you should be scheduled for an interview, you're SOL. And people still have this misconception that they need to continue the consular processing. The last communication that I got, and any of my clients that I know of got from the U.S. Embassy Kabul, which abruptly closed down in early August, was something in late August saying that we appreciate something to the effect of, we appreciate your patience. We want to let you know that we're in continued efforts in order to open up our activities or operations in Doha, Qatar, and that if you want your case transferred to Doha, Qatar, or any other embassy, any other post of your choosing, please contact the National Visa Center portal. So they give a link to the portal of where it's an inquiry portal, the general inquiry portal for the National Visa Center. So they give you that link. And then when you do that, it's really useless because they don't know what to do with your case in the first place. And then they kind of have their own thing and they kind of redirect you to somewhere else and then this and that.
But geographically, we're still talking, really, it seems to me, like you and your family in 1984, getting across Afghanistan to get into Pakistan somehow, even if you can get that foil or even if you can get that refugee document, to then get flown over to America. And if you can't make that trek, you're stuck.
Correct. And then obviously Pakistan is a very corrupt country itself, and the Afghans have historically been harassed by Pakistani officials for bribes and all kinds of things. So it's not easy.
You're not going to Iran.
Basically, yeah. So basically, they're on their own. Everybody is pretty much on their own in order to figure out how to make it out of there. And so, yeah. So unfortunately, this is where we're at. Allegedly, there are some talks between the U.S. government and the Taliban, and now we don't want to recognize them, and they want to be recognized, and then allegedly their monies are frozen, and they want the monies to be unfrozen, and there's absolutely no negotiating power for the United States.
It's very depressing, Bashir. I'm very sorry to hear that. I was kind of having this interview to hope that you were going to give me a silver bullet that was going to say that actually there is a way for these individuals to get out of Afghanistan right now, but it doesn't seem to be the case. But there are thousands of Afghan citizens who recently came to the United States who are here. The lucky few who did get humanitarian parole or individuals who did get special visas. What can be done right now for these individuals if you're an immigration attorney or if you're not an attorney at all? And what are some organizations that can help?
Yeah, these people, they're not entitled to all the, at least until December. There was the House Bill 5104 that was passed recently, and that brings some good news to this group of people where they will be treated and provided the same kind of benefits that refugees receive. So until then, these folks are not eligible for a lot of the services. So they need a lot of help. And a lot of them, they are paroled here, but they don't really have any long-term asylum case, for example. So they need asylum attorneys. They need to file affirmative asylum applications, or they need to file adjustment applications. Perhaps they already have an I-130 petition, but they were paroled in, so they still need to finish their I-485s. The limited amount of people that America was able to bring, they really need a lot of help. There's a lot of events. A lot of them live in, like if you live in San Diego area, they live in El Cajon, and you can sponsor those families. And that's what we do. I mean, we try to put people into contact with the right people and to try to, utilize all of this, basically transform the sentiment, the positive sentiment that everybody is showing into action.
And so for non-attorneys, what are some of the organizations that you would recommend people donate to?
Yeah, so basically there are the national organizations. There's a lot of organizations that are helping Afghans. I don't really want to start naming them, but locally, I would mention the ones that I'm kind of working together with is Council on American Islamic Relations, the San Diego chapter, Islamic Community of San Diego. Also, they're very intricately involved in Afghanistan issues now. There's very private individual groups. There's Myri's List is a very famous. They're very active on Facebook, and they help that. If you look at their page, it's amazing. All these volunteers are going out there and furnishing the apartments of the newcomers and all of that. And then, so there's a whole bunch of organizations. I'm kind of, I just try to do what I would do, and I'm not really involved officially with anybody. But when I see an organization that is really out there helping, I make sure to name them. Sponsorship goes also, you can not spend a penny and really not jeopardize yourself at all into any kind of a liability or legal commitment or anything by just simply being a humanitarian parole application sponsor. A lot of the families are suffering. They have a lot of family members in Afghanistan that they are trying to apply for humanitarian parole for. But they themselves don't earn enough money, or they have sponsored other people in order to qualify for sponsors. So they intricately need sponsors. If you're a member, or if you have some kind of a nonprofit organization, you can have organization sponsors. So basically, it's a promissory note saying that we will make sure to provide any kind of assistance in the event they need it. And when people are ultimately admitted or paroled, then specifically after December, of this year, they get all the rights and public benefits that are entitlement to all those public benefits that the refugees get, including housing and all that. So this I-134, to be honest with you, should not even be needed for Afghans. And it's a kind of a discouraging type of a tool where a lot of Afghans, they have all these applications ready to be filed, but they don't really have that sponsor to sign off on their behalf. And it's a formality that really has no practicable purposes or anything like that. So basically, there's nothing really going on for Afghans. There's the P1, P2, for example, the priority 1, priority 2, and priority 3 refugee status. A lot of the Afghans were referred to that, and a lot of them are getting approval notices, or not approval, but like they will get an email saying that, okay, we have done the preliminary review of your referral. Now you can go to a third country and apply for refugee status now with this letter to a third country and wait in line over there.
If you can get out of Afghanistan.
If you can get out of Afghanistan. So it's just the same thing as going, doing the refugee route. But apparently you're already pre-selected for a refugee status in Afghanistan. So that, if you have that pending, and then this IV, that's basically it. And obviously we saw what happened during evacuations. They just sent everybody who applied for evacuation was sent a document entitled a visa from the U.S. Embassy without any case name or case number. It's just like a certificate, like a made up thing called a visa, so they could go to the airport, and everybody got one of those. That's what actually was responsible for all the airport rush.
Bashir, I think we could talk for hours about this, but I think we do need to end this.
Oh, yeah, it's already, oh my God, 2 hours. Wow.
I'm going to edit it down. Don't you worry. I appreciate you taking the time. You're a very busy man these days. I'm sure you always have been. I look forward to meeting you in person one day. Thank you for taking the time to speak to me, to teach me about a lot of these issues.
Sounds good, Kevin. It was nice talking to you. Looking forward to speaking to you again sometime.
Thanks, Bashir. So there you have it. I'm Kevin A. Gregg, a partner with the law firm Kurzban, Tetzeli, and Pratt, and this has been another episode of Immigration Review. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please share it with a friend and rate and review us. Each review helps new listeners find the show. And of course, subscribe to Immigration Review wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what we do and want to become a patron of the show, please check out our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/Immigration Review, or click on the link in the show notes. And if you're interested in an official Immigration Review CLE certificate for 5 credit hours, email me at kgreg@kktplaw.com with your full name and the episode numbers for the 10 shows you've listened to. Also, feel free to email me with questions, comments, or anything at all. And follow the show on Instagram and Facebook @Immigration Review, and send us a tweet @ImReview. That's IMM Review. I'll be back next Monday for a brand new discussion. Until then, I'm Kevin A. Gregg, bringing you the Immigration Review.